Hello, everyone, and welcome to the With Chinese Characteristics podcast. I'm Natalie.
I'm Cherry.
And together we talk about topics with Chinese characteristics. And I have a topic for us today.
Ooh.
Yeah, I know, Cherry. From Chinese history. I have some stuff written, but I want to put it into perspective because the First Opium War in 1940 is sort of seen as the start of the century of shame.
Yeah.
Right? In Chinese history of...
It's not thought of, it's taught as.
But in reality, China before then was undergoing crises. Some of them just as bad as the First Opium War. And that's sort of just the one that made it into the history books. And in a way, it's sort of a Eurocentric view. Well, this was the first crisis that actively involved
the West
in a big way.
Yeah.
So that's the one that gets picked. But anyway, so this is kind of to put into context of this is what's happening in China, in the Qing Dynasty, leading up to the First Opium War, which is in 1840. To put into context, the Second Opium War is in 1860, around the same time as the U.S. Civil War. And there's a lot going on. So let's talk about it. So
okay.
In 1793, the ill-fated McCartney diplomatic mission, which we talked about in an earlier episode, visited China in order to petition the Chen Long emperor for greater trade rights. Brushed off and essentially humiliated, they left with their goals unobtained. Less than 50 years later, the British would ask for greater privileges again, this time at the head of a fleet of warships and naval infantry, an event known as the First Opium War. That's kind of the...
So they're not asking for the privilege.
No.
They're taking...
They're kind of demanding it.
Yeah.
But that's sort of the children's version of, right?
Yeah.
But believe it or not, this was not the first, second, third, or even fourth time the British had attempted in that period to gain their goals in China through force. It was, however, the first time they truly succeeded. And we're going to talk about some of those events.
Okay.
While British imperial power had increased over the intervening decades between these failed attempts, this was matched by an even steeper decline in the power and stability of the Qing Dynasty. This decline would leave the dynasty barely able to keep order within its own borders, let alone deal with the predations of foreign powers. So it's not just that the British Empire became stronger. It's also that the Qing Dynasty became weaker.
And it had problems domestically.
Yes, and it had other stuff to deal with. So being China's last imperial dynasty, for now, and also ruled by an ethnic minority, the Qing Dynasty gets a lot of criticism that I think is unfair.
Unfair.
Yeah, unfair.
Okay. All right. Let's hear it.
The crisis and problems it had to deal with are unique to its era. And it's not surprising such an ancient imperial system has problems adjusting.
True.
For example, the Tang Dynasty, if they were in this era, you know, how are they going to deal with gunboats and steamships and opium, right? They never had to deal with these problems.
Right.
So it's convenient to think that they would have done better.
So you're saying the overall imperial system, the imperial court, the way
the whole, eunuchs and the governors and the examination system.
The whole political system set up the same way as it has always been for a very long time.
And it's not exactly the same.
Okay.
But, you know, it's the same general tools, right?
Okay.
You've had the imperial examinations for thousands of years. You know what I mean? You have the court, you have the eunuchs, you have the emperor.
Right.
You have this central authority. You have kind of a lack of good information a lot of times of what's going on in the provinces.
Right. Yeah, so they had inherited that.
Yes.
Maybe changed some things, but the overall is the same structure.
Yes.
Okay, and you're saying that same set of tools it
has trouble adjusting to these things.
Okay.
And that's true not just in China though, but if you look at Europe, this is the same time period where old dictatorships and empires and things are falling and becoming republics and constitutional monarchies, different things like that.
So they had to change to adapt.
Yes, right? So this isn't a problem unique to China.
Okay.
But the Qing Dynasty is the one that has to deal with it, right? They're the ones in the driver's seat during this time period.
In China. Yeah, in China.
In China, yeah. So the dynasty was founded in 1644 when the Manchu people, who are a different flavor of steppe horse people than Mongolians.
But I don't know if I would call them steppe horse people. They're just, I don't know if I'm as a Chinese person, I would be okay being called the rice people. I just feel like that's not a fair, that's not all they do.
Okay.
I think you're minimizing an ethnic minority.
They do have a lot of other things. They have culture. They have their own language.
Yeah, so let's not
okay.
Yeah.
Well, they would be considered, I guess. a more, in the kind of mandate of heaven sort of philosophy, a more energetic people
Yeah.
on the edge of China.
On
the northeast edge of
Asia,
China.
Yeah.
So they're more energetic, better at fighting people
Yes.
on the north.
They put an emphasis on martial arts and
Yes.
and horse riding
And
skills
archery.
archery.
And
Yes.
all that.
Yes.
The rice people.
Horse people.
Okay. So that's fair. They do other stuff too.
Thank you.
So we talked about this in one of our Peasant Rebellion episodes, but prior to their invasion, there was a massive peasant rebellion it was Ming Dynasty.
Yeah.
And that peasant rebellion.
Just one?
What was that?
There were many.
Yeah, many.
That was a bad joke.
There were a lot of peasants.
Yeah. Okay.
But
we're
that
talking about
rebellion
one of them.
actually succeeded.
Yeah. Which one was that?
Which rebellion was it?
Yeah.
I don't
Did it have a
remember
name?
the name. We did an episode. Don't say which rebellion it is. I cut this out. So, so they actually succeeded,
Okay.
but like as they were succeeding, the Manchus came in,
Yeah.
famously led in by a general of the Ming Dynasty who didn't want
was
to
the general.
have a peasant emperor, I guess. They came in.
I think there was some court
Drama there.
that the general's father was, I think, killed or sacrificed.
Yeah.
In the war and in the rebellion, something like that.
I'm sure there's been about 50 movies about
yeah,
it.
and there's many
And
period
TV
dramas
shows.
based on it. Yeah, but he sort of is seen as a betrayal of the Han race. I don't know. Yeah. So
Well, we're going to talk about nationalism though, because that's
Okay.
that'd be a modern take on it, right?
that would be yes.
Yeah.
True.
So, but basically, they put down a bunch of rebellions. Over the next maybe 50 years, they firmly got a grasp of all of China,
Yeah.
what we consider China, and then started expanding the borders, basically the modern day borders of China,
Yeah.
north into Mongolia, west into Tibet. Most of this was done by the Emperor Kangxi, who's the most, I guess, famous Chinese emperor of recent history,
Yeah.
who he ruled for 61 years. His successor was the Yongzheng emperor.
Yongzheng.
Yongzheng.
Yeah. Okay. Just cut this out.
Okay.
Yongzheng emperor.
Yongzheng. His successor was the Yongzheng emperor, and then the Chen Long emperor, who would rule power for even longer. This is the same Chen Long emperor that the McCartney expedition
Yes.
met with. And this set up China for over a century of stable and relatively peaceful rule. However, by the end of the 1800s, the cracks were starting to show in the strength of the dynasty. Now let's talk about the problems that were happening by about 1800.
Okay.
And it would get worse up until, basically, for the next 100 years. So number one is the population. So in 1700, the population in China was roughly 150 million.
Okay.
A number it had fluctuated around for about the past 1,000 years.
Okay.
So sometimes it would go as low as like maybe 70s or 60s. Other times it might go into like the high 100s, like 180s.
Mm-hmm.
And some of this is not just people, but also territory. Because
Okay.
as China would get bigger and smaller, or different parts would be part of it, that would
Right.
create swings in the population as well.
True.
By 1800, it was about 400 million.
Oh wow.
And by 1840, it was about 450 million.
Okay.
So the population tripled in about 100 years, 150 years.
That's pretty dramatic.
It's pretty dramatic, especially when you consider that, this is before the mechanization of agriculture. This is before like modern fertilizers, right? This is still using the tools of
Old-timey
farming.
farming. So what happened? Was it just peace?
Well, okay, so there's a couple of things. So one is people aren't 100% sure, right? Because it's a lot of factors involved here. But one of them is New World crops. There's this idea of China as this closed kingdom,
New World crops.
like the Americas.
Okay.
So peppers, sweet
Like Chinese.
potatoes, corn, new kinds of beans.
Okay. Got into China.
Tomatoes.
Okay.
All of those originated in, the quote unquote the New World.
Yeah.
But it was new to China too. So, and those came from Spanish and Portuguese traders.
Okay.
Probably Dutch too, and made it to China. And those fill in a lot of the gaps in nutrition, that you don't just get from like rice or other vegetables. Potatoes grow like everywhere.
Yeah.
Peanuts are another one, I think, that came from the New World.
Oh wow. Okay.
And those created a lot more calories and a lot more things to grow. And so that more calories means more food.
Yes.
So already, right, you think, by the 1600s, China is already being influenced by this global trade, right? It's not a closed little kingdom.
I wonder if we can do an episode on it. At which point did what food crops got into China?
Oh, I'm sure, right?
Yeah.
Because there's certain things like people think about like, oh, well, like
so traditional.
Yeah, like Sichuan cuisine. And it's like, well, they didn't have peppers until they got there.
Yeah.
Or even like in Europe, like Italians didn't have tomatoes.
Yes.
And they got tomatoes from Americas. So other things are better healthcare. So there was better like birthing procedures that they figured out that you'll have less babies die. They got better at smallpox inoculations.
Okay.
So where you would take like dried bits of the sores of
vaccines.
It wasn't vaccines because a vaccine is a weaker version of the virus.
Okay.
So for smallpox, they figured out you could use cowpox, which is a related virus. But for smallpox, if you gave people ground up bits of people who had already had the virus, like you give them like their ground up sores, you like blow it up their nose, and they would catch smallpox, but they would normally live, and then they're immune to it from thereafter.
They will catch smallpox like a weaker version of smallpox?
Weaker version usually.
All right.
You still maybe had like a 5% chance to die or something.
Okay.
But if you caught smallpox normally, you had like a 40% chance to die. So.
Okay, trade-offs.
Yeah, pretty good deal.
Calculated risks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, the peace, as you said, good administration. Less floods, natural disasters, and stuff because you have good management of the rivers, and also a lot more land was cleared because when there is peace, instead of villages getting burned down and whatever, people are going into forests and hills and clearing land and creating new farms.
Okay.
So this in of itself does not cause instability necessarily, but it
sounds like a good time.
It sounds like a good time.
Yeah.
But this huge growth in population is going to cause a lot of problems because we talked about a second ago, the imperial system is old.
Outdated.
It's outdated and it doesn't react well to change necessarily. The way it normally reacts to change is there's a peasant rebellion and somebody else takes over.
Yes.
So it has trouble adjusting to this huge growth in population.
Okay.
So number 2 is the Manchus. So by design, the Manchu court and people were kept separate from the main Chinese population.
Oh, yeah.
Believing their unique culture gave them an edge, they kept traditional language, dress, and on paper, combat skills alive.
Yeah.
And this is different than, like the Ren Dynasty, the Mongols. They didn't do this as much. Yeah. The Manchus really, they thought, okay, we're going in here, but we gotta have a long-term plan.
They were very adamant about it.
Yes.
And they even built an extension of like a part of the Great Wall to stop Han people from going to the Manchurian area.
Yeah, building farms in Manchuria.
Yeah.
So they had walled settlements inside of larger Chinese cities as like a garrison.
Yeah.
They were kind of intended to be the muscle behind the Qing Dynasty. Like if some stuff really kicked off, we'll use the Manchus. They were only allowed to live in China temporarily sometimes. Like they got to go spend the summer or the winter back in Manchuria and shoot arrows at rabbits.
Okay.
All that kind of stuff to hone their warrior instincts.
Yeah. And
there's this idea that's almost like, I don't know, like the Terracotta Warriors or something, where they're frozen in time. And, that when we need them, it's like, we'll blow the horn and all these buff.
It's like magically they will just show up.
Yeah, all these buff, like
on horseback.
Tough guys on fur and horseback will show up and they'll put down the rebellion or do whatever. Then they'll go back to the wilderness, right?
Right.
But it didn't work out that way because 100 years of peace, people, they get comfortable, right?
They get lazy.
They get lazy, they get comfortable.
Yeah.
But so most of them lose this, right?
Okay.
Most of them just become slightly ethnically different, culturally different Chinese people.
Okay.
Right, in the cities with a different language and, but, they're not out every day doing archery practice. So there are still some that are, I guess, tough, as you would say, but these are becoming increasingly rare.
Okay.
And these are needed on the frontier.
Right.
So they're not really the ones that are in interior China.
So you don't have internal muscles Not effective ones.
Not effective. So most Manchu are only warriors in name. A lot of them have poorly maintained or even sold their weapons. A lot of them also took other jobs or did other stuff to supplement like the stipend they got from the government to theoretically.
They don't get paid much.
No.
Okay.
No. It's basically China had a serious problem with inflation during this time period because you have 3 times the people, which means that a lot of goods, you don't have 3 times as many of the goods.
Right.
So, and so things became more expensive. And when you have payment schemes that were set up, maybe haven't changed in 60 years, it can't adjust with the times.
Okay.
So despite this, they still have an oversized role in government compared to other ethnic groups based on their size. Mm-hmm. They have an easier version of the imperial exam that they can take if you're Manchu, and they're overly represented in the government.
I think overly represented is a understatement.
Yes, right? Well, they're the whole imperial court.
Yeah.
There are Han Chinese officials.
Yeah.
Right? Some relatively high up. Mm-hmm. But, there's a lot of Manchu officials because they get an easier version of the test.
Yeah.
So anti-Manchu resentment is nothing new in Qing China. It's there from the start. Mm-hmm. There's lots of rebellions, lots of fighting. But the waning martial ability of the Manchu banner forces, which is you have the Manchu banner forces who are the ones like, they're like the warriors are supposed to come from the hills, right? And then you have the green standard forces, kind of the local Chinese forces who are supposed to be more like police or militia.
Okay.
The banner forces, they become less and less effective as time goes on. Okay. Which means that now you have a risk because if there is a rebellion, they might not be able to put it down. Now let's talk about the government.
Okay.
So China's tax and government system and how it's determined and how it's divisioned is based largely on land, not on people, at least during this time period. You would say you have to pay this much tax on this much land that's under cultivation, or this much, or this official is in charge of these borders of an area, which doesn't really take into account how many people are there.
True.
So because of that, when the amount of people triples, it causes problems because you still have the same amount of government officials and bureaucracy and the same amount of taxes because you have 3 times the people. You have 3 times the people with the same amount of land. Yeah. So you need to pay there's more stuff to be paid for when you have 3 times as many people.
There's more stuff to maintain.
Yeah, more stuff to maintain.
Yeah, more money to spend.
Yes.
So the government income remains the same, though.
The government income basically remains the same. Okay. And you have the same amount of officials, which means they don't have enough time to get everything done. Right. So the population exploded. The government officials are now often in charge of 2 to 5 times the number of people, but with an unchanged tax base. This begins to cause more and more problems as overloaded officials become unable to meet all their duties within given budgets. This results in a large amount of deferred maintenance on the local level. Okay. Compounding this is there's now 3 times as many people or more taking the civil service exams for the same number of slots. Which means it's even more competitive than it ever was before. Right.
And it was already very competitive.
It was already
for
very
a Hong
Chinese
person, yeah.
And now there's the more Manchu people, and so they take an easier test, so they eat into even more the amount of slots that for Han Chinese people to take the test. Right. Which means there's an incredible amount of competition among well-to-do Chinese families. Trying to get the test passed. And we've talked about it in a bunch of episodes, but the civil service examination is how you became a government official, and that's the path in China during this time period towards riches. You could be a merchant and become rich, but it's not nearly as socially respectable.
No. Power's power.
Yeah, power's power.
Political power in addition to your money. Otherwise, the money, just like today. Yeah. Otherwise, the money doesn't count.
Yeah. It's almost like the equivalent of if you do really well on a test, you get to become a senator or something.
Yes. That's all you need, not votes.
Not votes. Yeah. You just got to do really well on a test. So this bottleneck creates intense competition, pushing pass rates for the higher exams to 1% or less.
Oh, wow.
Because you've got the provincial, right? You've got the regional or whatever, and then you've got the imperial.
I wonder what's the acceptance rate for like today's government official exam. I think it's less than 1%.
You really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. Do you have your phone?
Maybe we can do an episode on the modern civil service examination in China. This created a huge pool of essentially angry test takers who were smart and educated and feeling hopeless after indebting themselves and their families.
Yeah.
This is almost like incels, but with civil service.
I just really like it. Angry test takers.
Yeah.
The real dangerous group.
Well, Hong Xiuquan,
Yeah.
the instigator of the Taiping Civil War, famously failed multiple times.
Yes.
So they are angry, and it is a big problem.
Yeah.
Because you have people who, they maybe take the test 5 or 6 times. Mm-hmm. They're in a lot of debt. They're really angry, and they blame the state. The system. And those who do pass, they need to use their position to extort huge bribes to pay back their debts or to enrich themselves. And even if you're an honest civil administrator, because there's 4 or 5 times the amount of people in your province, you can't do it all on your own. So you have to hire assistants,
Right.
which you don't have the budget for.
No.
So you got to do a little corruption, regardless, just to pay for everything.
Yeah. Well, you have to survive in a corrupt system. If the pond is muddy.
Is this some ancient Chinese wisdom we're about to?
If the pond is muddy, I guess you just have to live in a muddy pond.
I thought you were going
If the pond is too clear, I don't know where I'm going with this. But you have to be, if the system's corrupt, and if you're not, and you won't even survive in the system, you will just get washed out.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say everyone who remains, it's not a moral judgment call. It's just what it is.
Well, there's some who aren't corrupt.
Okay.
Famously. But ironically, those are going to be some of the ones who cause problems. Like Lin Zexu.
Lin Zexu, yeah.
Yeah, is the guy who essentially kicks off the First Opium War.
Yeah.
Because he is a guy who cannot be bargained with or
bought
or bribed.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're the ones who aren't corrupt become extremely inflexible almost in almost response. So basically you have huge population, you have the ruling kind of class has lost its mojo. The government is essentially becoming more and more dysfunctional and corrupt.
Yeah.
So you get rebellions, which, is a thing that happens. And you always, I think, even probably in the 100 years, you're going to get small rebellions and things. But they really start to kick off near the end of Chen Long's reign, his 62-year-old reign. And he even steps down as emperor and gives it to the next guy. He still sort of stays in power.
Okay.
In the shadows, kind of like Cixi later as the, Dowager Empress. But he's real old and he kind of has lost the plot.
Yeah.
And he kind of is a pretty bad emperor at that point.
Yeah. I mean, when has it worked out that the old emperor just
rules from the shadows?
Rules from the shadows.
Yeah.
Can't think of a good example.
No.
If our listeners know.
Of a shadow emperor who did a good job.
Yeah, let us know.
So these are going to explode in 1794, which is actually, the year the McCartney expedition is heading back. In the White Lotus rebellions, which the White Lotus is a common symbol.
Yeah.
I feel like if you're a rebellion in China, the rule is you pick a color and an object.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, we're the Green Flag Rebellion.
Yes.
We're the yellow turban rebellion. You just pick 2 things and there you go.
Yeah.
It's an interesting rebellion. It's kind of got a Buddhist angle and but in the end, it's just because people aren't happy, right? People aren't happy. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of inflation. There's a lot of other problems, which we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
So a lot of provinces explode into rebellion. Hundreds of thousands rebelled in eastern China, and the Qing initially had great difficulty putting them down because they're kind of in sort of mountainous regions in eastern China.
Okay.
So the 8 banners, seen as the elite Manchu forces, were not meant for internal policing matters, and instead local Han forces, the Green Standard, were used instead. A series of poor commanders, bad tactics, and incredible amounts of corruption plagued the suppression campaign. The suppression campaign was actually run by a guy named Hessian, who was, I don't know if you remember from the
Hessian?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's also he's almost a pop culture.
Of corruption?
Of corruption. Yeah, pop culture representation.
Yeah. And he's the guy who, I don't know if you remember the McCartney, but the Grand Chala, who they're always like, there's this fictional position called the Grand Chala that they kept thinking they were going to meet.
Okay.
So that's actually him.
Mm-hmm.
So he was the guy that the McCartney expedition dealt with.
Okay.
But yeah, like comical amounts of corruption.
Yes.
And prior to this rebellion, the Qing Dynasty was hugely in the green I guess in the red in terms of finances, right?
Okay.
Because, in China, red means up,
Yeah.
and green means down, right?
It's the opposite.
That's the opposite.
On the stock market. But
Yeah.
yes.
Eventually though, Chen Long leaves,
Mm-hmm.
and the next emperor who has to deal with this all, the corruption's so bad that after he kills Hessian, like he kind of just has to stop investigating
Mm-hmm.
because it's like he'd have to execute the whole court.
Yeah.
And, so he just kind of has to just, accept it.
Yeah.
Eventually, the next emperor did send in Manchu forces alongside a seasoned general named Eldonbu, who eventually ended the rebellion in 1804. Eldonbu would be one of the last of a dying breed Manchu commanders experienced in warfare and used to the trials of campaign.
Mm.
Despite the success, hundreds of thousands of killed, and I think it was like 90 million taels of silver were spent.
Oh,
So
boy.
a tael of silver is like an ounce of silver,
Yeah.
basically.
So a lot of silver.
Yeah. And there really aren't that many moving forward, especially you'll see 40 years later in the First Opium War. It's not just about being tough, right? Which is, I think, sometimes how it's framed is,
Mm-hmm.
You have to have people in charge of these armies who
Yeah.
understand, like, how supplies work,
Yeah.
how to recruit, how to train people, get the equipment, like how to run this stuff.
You mean it's almost like warfare is an operation,
It is an operation.
not just one like the hero the
yeah.
great man theory.
Yeah, great man theory. And it's a big logistical,
Yeah.
and you have to be, I guess, tough in a sense, but you also have to understand the profession of
Yeah.
waging war,
Yes.
which is why this period in the West they're building military academies to try and
Yeah.
teach that to people.
So you're saying the Qing court is losing that ability,
Yes, because it's all a learned experience
right?
in this time period in China,
Well,
right?
if you don't have any experience,
Yeah.
because it's peacetime.
Yeah, so people
Yeah.
will read books and Sun Tzu and all this stuff, but it's different than actually understanding the mechanics of
Yeah.
how to run a campaign and do and so those
All we need to know, all we need to do is to go back to the books
yeah, exactly,
of the ancient Chinese wisdom.
yeah, just know a couple
Writers.
proverbs and you'll be good to go.
Yeah.
And it is true that whenever there is a war,
Mm-hmm.
people will pick this stuff up,
Yes.
right? But it's a big learning curve, and a lot of people, you'll see this in the Taiping Civil War, where especially on the Chinese, the Qing Dynasty side, eventually you get people who are good and can win the war.
But wouldn't that be kind of like too late at that point?
Well, I mean,
50
million people had died at that point,
Yeah.
but eventually, so it's a big learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
And in the White Lotus Rebellion, they eventually just get a guy who still knows how to do it, and he's like 55 on the campaign, and he can only speak Chinese. He can't write Chinese. He can only write Manchu,
Okay.
right? Because this is the kind of generation,
Yeah.
right? And he's one of the last, so they're almost all gone after him. That was a disaster. It doesn't end until 1804. And then at sea, you have this, and we might do a whole episode on it, you have this massive explosion of pirates.
Mm-hmm.
Because after the Qing Dynasty took back Taiwan, they basically just let all their ships rot. Because famously, there was a kingdom in Taiwan. There's like a Ming loyalist kingdom in Taiwan
Yeah.
that was there for like 40 years or something. And, Kangxi built all the boats and they took it back.
Yeah.
But then they kind of just let all the boats rot.
They're like, we don't need a navy
Yeah, we
anymore.
don't need a navy anymore. We got it back.
Yeah.
And because of that, over time, and also because of increased trade, because partially because of all these Western people,
Well, there's going to be pirates.
there's going to be pirates.
Yeah.
And the attention was diverted to the White Lotus Rebellion, which means the pirate problem got worse.
Right.
And so throughout this period, there's, hundreds and hundreds of pirate vessels all over. They're kidnapping everyone. They're kidnapping Westerners and Chinese. They're involved in the opium trade, all this stuff. And there's actually some pretty interesting foreign accounts of people who got kidnapped by the pirates, and they basically made them go on the ships and, help them do their pirate stuff. And then eventually they would get ransomed
Okay.
by people in like Macau or something. They took a softer approach with the pirates. I think they just did like, we don't have the money to build a navy to kill all these guys. So they kind of played them off against each other. And the more powerful ones that they felt like they could deal with, they kind of just gave them official positions and folded them into the fleets,
right?
The kind of defense fleets for the different areas. But even still, that cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a hit to prestige because they're attacking Western trading vessels and all these things. So this huge cost of money and also in attention, these are the things that are occupying their time and their resources, during the early 1800s, is all these rebellions and pirates. And the huge amount of debt that they got put into means they have to make cuts. And one of the things they cut moving forward is the military. Is they cut on the amount of money they're paying to soldiers. They're cutting down on equipment, cutting down on training, exercises, all these sort of things, maintaining fortresses. Because
that sounds like the beginning of the end of something.
Yeah. And they're like, okay, we solved the problem. We put down the rebellion.
Yeah.
Now that we can save a little money for the next, 20, 30 years. And obviously that's going to be a problem because who's not making budget cuts is United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And all these crazy Westerners out there. Now let's talk about the silver. And in this modern world where almost no currency, maybe like Bitcoin or something, nothing is backed by a precious metal. It's kind of easy to forget that when you have a currency based on a finite resource, it causes a lot of problems.
Yeah.
Because your internal economy is all based around the value of that resource.
Yeah.
And things can happen outside your economy
that you have no control.
You have no control over to completely destabilize it.
Yeah.
And it's not like you can just make more silver, right? Or make less silver, right? It's just there, right?
Yeah.
And this is partially I talked about the rebellions first. A, the rebellions use up a lot of the silver from the government, but B, a lot of rebellions are going to be caused because of this silver issue. That's getting worse and worse. So, and arguably the whole First Opium War is caused by this issue, which kicks off everything else.
Right.
So it's not as sexy as opium, but it's a big deal. So in the Qing Dynasty, China has two main types of money. They have copper alloy coins of, there's other stuff in there with the copper for day-to-day interactions. And then you have silver for taxes and larger deals. Now silver, so China throughout the centuries has had multiple currency systems, it's kind of hard to generalize.
Right.
But, there's innovations like paper money, which come out.
Yeah.
But typically you normally have like one currency for all internal trade. Mm-hmm. And then you have silver, which is used for external trade because, if you're trading along the Silk Road, they don't want Chinese coins, right? They want silver.
Right.
But the Qing Dynasty keeps silver as an actual internal currency.
Okay. Whereas
that's how government business is done, is essentially in silver.
Right.
Which is different than a lot of the other Chinese dynasties.
So when I watch like period drama, they would have paper money though. They would have, and they call them 银票, which is silver papers.
Yeah. Well, what time period?
Qing. I mean, I'm not saying those period dramas are, accurate to history.
Yeah.
But you're saying there is no paper money during the Qing Dynasty at this time.
No. So paper money, there might have been notes backed on silver. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's always sort of like trade notes.
Right.
Right. But like, you go to one bank in one city and they give you a paper saying you gave me 100 silver and that way you can travel. You don't have to carry the silver with you.
Right.
Another bank, gives you. So there's that kind of stuff, but there's no official like paper currency during this time period.
Oh, okay.
The interesting thing is about the silver is it's not in coin form. It's all by weight, right?
Okay.
So there's no like official like, oh, this piece of silver with a certain shape with a certain stamp on it is worth this much. Whenever you wanted to pay for something or do some sort of transaction, you would weigh it. You'd have a scale.
That seems like a lot of trouble for every trade, every transaction. When I go buy some soap, I need to...
No, because everything local is copper.
Copper coins. Okay.
Yes, copper or bronze coins, right? It's all... So this is for bigger stuff.
Okay.
And there are... I'm sure you've heard like Rembow, like little... There's certain little shapes that they commonly melt the silver into.
Yes. Now you're saying Rembow.
Rembow of little sizes.
Yeah. It's like a shape of metal that you forge into that
Yeah.
can be measured and counted.
It's sort of like a standardized weight, but they would still weigh them.
Yeah, it looks like a metal dumpling.
Yeah, it kind of does look like a metal dumpling. Because of this is a big opportunity for corruption because,
Of course. Okay.
you know, everybody's got their own scales, everybody's got their own weight,
Yeah.
you know, and so it's
Can I just forge the Rembow like you know, hollow?
yeah. Well, they, you know what I mean, but it
Yeah.
still has to have the right weight, right?
Okay.
So it's kind of a not a very efficient system, I feel like. But
Muddy waters.
muddy waters, yeah. So a tael, which is the unit that always gets referenced, is about an ounce. I think now in modern China, it's set to 50 grams as a tael. But at this time period, it seems like it was more like 30, 40 grams for a tael of silver.
Okay.
So originally pegged at one string of copper coins to one tael of silver. So a string of copper coins is 1,000 coins on a string. So you've probably seen a lot of Asian coins. Japanese ones too have holes in the middle.
Right.
And so you can put them on a string. And so 1,000, it was 1,000 copper coins to 1 ounce of silver. And this is at the start of the Qing Dynasty. And this was fluctuate over time. So this meant that social stability was influenced by the value of copper to silver because farmers would essentially have to pay more in taxes if silver costed more.
Right.
Because I mean, I'm not saying individual farmers would have to go buy silver, but your local landlord would say like, hey, silver costs more. I'm going to need more copper coins from you because I have to buy the silver and pay the taxes.
It's almost like a different currency than copper and silver. They don't adjust the values. They don't adjust together.
No.
The ratio can change.
The ratio can change, right?
So it's
not
almost like today, if you have exchange rates between
it's like
different currencies
it's
of
like
different
two
countries.
Yeah. So it's like two countries. It's two completely separate.
That creates a class divide then, though, right? Because like the people who use the copper coin are like
poor.
the underclass, and they only get squeezed more.
Yes.
When the times are bad. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it causes a lot of problems. When times are good, silver's plentiful. That means that taxes are essentially cheap, right? But when times are bad, taxes are rough. We talked about earlier the population. And when you have 3 times the amount of people, it means that naturally silver is going to become more rare.
Right.
Right? Because, you know, you have more people, there's more transaction. You need more currency in the economy.
To go around.
Yes. And so they can make more copper coins, right? You can just make that, right? They have the stuff. They can just, as many mints as they want to make, essentially they can do it.
Okay.
But you only have so much silver. So that creates inflation in the cost of silver, which means that over time, taxes essentially get worse and worse for farmers and goods become more and more expensive to buy copper coins.
Yeah.
So by like 1850, you would need like 2,000 copper coins to buy an ounce of silver. So basically it doubled.
So tax has doubled.
Yeah,
essentially.
more or less taxes doubled. For example, in 1790, a string of coins, 1,000 coins, could buy a month's worth of rice, about 50 kilograms of rice.
Okay.
In 1810, it could only buy half that.
Okay.
It's getting tougher for the little guy.
Right.
So this drove instability in a huge way. Taxes became more and more expensive, and farmers could not afford to buy food if they had a bad harvest. You might ask, why not just get more silver? China has a very low internal production of silver in this period, and many of the ways you get around low silver are not easily done with their system. So there's a thing that you can do if you have silver coins or gold coins normally, although I think it's easier with silver, which is called debasement, where if you have, let's say, silver coins that are like 90% silver, whenever you get silver coins in for taxes, you melt them down and you put like lead in there and you send them back out at like 60% silver.
Right.
And then you get like 50% more coins.
Yes.
And as long as no one really realizes you're doing it, it's kind of no harm, no foul.
Right.
And ideally, when times are better, you melt them back down and you get them back to the right.
Okay.
So, you know, there's kind of an ease there.
Right.
But the problem with this is it's all weighed and it's all based on individual things. Like the silver is not stamped into something that has a certain value.
Right.
So there's not really any way around this except by getting more silver.
Right. Seems like a very flawed
Yeah, it's
currency system.
It's not a great system, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is what people act like. Oh, why did the United States? Why do these people go off the gold and silver standard? It's like, well, because you get a lot of problems when you have things tied to some metal sitting in a vault somewhere.
Yeah.
So the only way to get more silver is to get it from somewhere else,
Okay.
which is trade, and this is an issue that the Qing were well aware of. And this is what they did. So in this whole period when population was increasing, they needed more silver. They got mountains and mountains of silver from the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the silver trade. Despite their isolation diplomatically, you can't really see the emperor. Economically,
Yeah.
the Qing were heavily invested in global trade.
Yes.
This global system was heavily influenced and powered by China's need for silver.
Right.
So originally receiving most of its silver from Japan, Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the New World produced an explosion of silver, which was traded to China in exchange for other goods. So Edo period Japan had lots of silver, although I think China still didn't have official diplomatic relations with Japan in this period because they were still mad about, Korea.
Yeah.
The war that happened.
Lots of history there.
But it was sort of an unofficial, there was middlemen basically. And so they got a bunch of silver from Japan. But then, famously Columbus and the Americas, huge amounts of silver.
Yeah.
That silver, ultimately a lot of it made its way to China. Because silver was worth more in China than it was in Europe. It was worth like 2 or 3 times as much.
Right.
So you could go to China and buy silks and spices and porcelain and then bring it back to Europe and make way more money than if you had just sold the silver. So this essentially creates what is going to become the Western trade system through to China, which is going to be influencing, the whole century of shame. So that's why you have places like Macau. That's why the Spanish colonized the Philippines and Manila. That's why you have, partially why even you have British colonizing things, because you need stop-offs.
Oh, okay.
On the way to China for this massive trade.
Right.
And it's pretty likely that if the Qing Dynasty did not have this massive demand for silver, none of this would exist. There would be no reason to go that far to create these things. But the profit you got from taking the silver there made it all worthwhile.
So they were trying to get to China, but obviously in order to get to China, it's a long distance away.
Yeah.
So you need stops and ports along the route.
Yeah.
And then they colonized those ports and
that's why
stop points.
I think that some of the really old colonies, it's like a city or a port.
Right.
They're not interested in taking over necessarily like entire countries or islands, right? They just need some place
to make them some money.
Yeah, to make them some money.
Well, that makes it okay then.
Yeah, I know, right?
I'm being sarcastic. Yeah.
So despite the limited avenues for Western trade, right, still there's only a couple cities even in this time period, huge amounts of silver flooded into the country. This trade was so important that when the Qing instituted their various trade sea restrictions, which we talked about a bit in the McCartney episode, from the late 1600s to the early 1700s, it created big economic issues for the Spanish Empire. Because you have this global trade network, and then when trade gets cut off because, Kangxi wants to invade Taiwan or whatever.
Right.
You
mean take back Taiwan?
Yeah, take back Taiwan.
Yeah.
As a general rule, silver was never exported, only imported into China, meaning that every year China's stock of silver grew, offsetting the change in population.
Right.
However, in the early 1800s, several things would happen to halt and even reverse the flow of silver into China. Most important of these are the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. Isn't that not where you thought I was going with this?
No.
You thought I was going to say opium?
Yeah.
Which began in 1808.
Okay. So that's okay.
All of basically Central and South America on the western side was controlled by the Spanish crown.
Okay.
You had like Brazil and other stuff on the eastern side that was by Portugal.
Right.
And all of these territories rose up in revolution and formed independent republics, which disrupted the flow of silver.
Of trade. Yeah, of
right?
silver trade.
And partially because of the war and partially because all these ships and all these routes were all Spanish. And, it takes some time to adjust. And it would kind of come back a little. For example, a lot of American traders would bring South American or Central American silver to trade to China.
Okay.
But this was a huge shock in the supply.
Right.
And it was almost instant.
Right.
It all got cut off. So Mexico, Venezuela, Peru, and essentially all of the mainland Spanish colonies in the New World were now independent. So this was a huge shock. And foreign traders began trying to find other goods they could trade with in order to make up for the lack of silver. Because silver is now more expensive in Europe too.
Yeah.
So, you're like, hey, we'll give you some wool. Can we trade that for the silk? Do you want to buy these clocks?
Yeah.
Because it's trying to say like, well, can we just give them something else and just barter?
Right.
Essentially, rather than just bringing silver.
Right.
Which the
China
Qing Dynasty
was
yeah.
Or silver goblin.
Yeah.
Only want silver.
Yeah. And there was some of that, right? But
Yeah.
it was definitely not preferred. And you really had to have a good relationship with the merchants in Canton to get that done.
Yeah.
The trade was still very profitable.
Okay.
Everybody's making a lot of money, even with this, silver disruption. There's a Canton merchant named Wu Bingjian. You know who I'm talking about?
Mm-mm.
He's known in the West as Haokua.
Okay.
Who or Hokua.
Why?
So there's only like 10 merchants who can trade with foreigners in all of Canton.
Okay.
And they're incredibly rich. And
when you say they can, meaning like they got the permission from the government?
Yeah, they got the permission.
Okay.
So that also got to go through him. And at this time period, he was the richest person in the world.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right.
So
he's the Jeff Bezos of the time.
He was so rich that he would send money back to places like America to invest in American companies.
Right.
Because just
gotta do something about the money. Yeah.
Yes.
Gotta put the money somewhere.
But where this money wasn't going is into
the Chinese government.
and the Qing currency system.
Right.
So this is a big problem, and they understood this was a problem.
Have they done what? Have they not learned from today's Chinese government what they do to Alibaba and
just take
and all they kind of just take it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, interestingly, Wu Bingjian, he ends up paying a big percentage of the Opium War silver. He just pays it out of his own money,
right?
To the British government. So they do kind of do that. So enter opium, which is I think the typical villain of the story.
Yeah.
The war is named after it.
Yeah.
So the history is gonna it deserves its own episode, but it's been going on for centuries at this point, but not on a large scale.
Okay.
Even so far back as there's a famous book called Robinson Crusoe about a castaway in the South Pacific. And once he gets rescued off, I think it was from like the 1600s.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, once I get off this island, I'm going to go get in the opium trade, right? Because you can really make some good money there. So this is nothing new, the opium trade.
Okay.
However, at the start of the 1800s, the trade is going to increase dramatically for a number of reasons. So opium has been officially illegal in China at this point since 1729, outlawed it for recreational use. So this means there's a quasi-legal market for it as medicine, which is fair because opium is a medicine, right? We use opium devolved compounds for medicine today. We use it as a painkiller. You use it for digestive problems because it can stop diarrhea. It slows down the digestive system.
I didn't know that.
There are things that it does. It is a real medicine.
Okay.
But it's also fun, which is
which is not allowed.
Yeah, which is not allowed. So it's a small trade. People do use it recreationally, but it's very expensive. So only rich people can use it, and it's kind of a luxury good. So it gets smuggled in small amounts.
So nothing to concern the government with yet.
Yeah, and it's mainly produced in British India.
Okay.
So the failure of the McCartney mission in 1793 meant that the East India Company and the UK still had a serious trade imbalance with China. Opium was seen as a good trade good to make up this balance. Now, and this would obviously become even more important when the Spanish-American Wars of Independence cut off silver, which means, it's too expensive to bring silver to China. And basically there was a system where the East India Company would not smuggle it into China because they did not want to get in trouble with the Chinese government. So what they would do is they would just produce the opium in India and sell it.
Okay.
And then they're like, hey, you know, whatever you do with it, it's not our
If
problem.
you bring it to China, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's like they sell with a sticker that says like, do not bring to China, which everybody brings it to China.
Yeah.
And they smuggle it, you know, into China.
Right.
Basically, the ships would go anchor off the coast. Chinese ships would come up in the night. They'd put the opium on the Chinese ships. And so the foreign ships would never really have to get their hands dirty. All of the actual smuggling and all of the bringing the drug into China was done by Chinese people.
Right.
The East India Company, they've made their money once they've sold it in India, and the smugglers have made their money once they offload it off the coast. So
it's a job creator then.
It's
for
a
the
job,
Chinese people.
Yeah, job creator, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're trying to, that's what the British are, just trying to bring jobs to the community. As you can imagine, it made a bunch of money. It made a bunch of money for the East India Company and helped offset the colonization of India, which was very expensive. And it made a lot of money for traders. Who it didn't make a lot of money for was the Qing Dynasty.
I mean, that's the problem with black market trades.
Yeah, right? You can't regulate them.
Can't make any tax income out of it.
Yeah. So when people would come and get the opium off the shore, they would pay in silver, right? They would pay in Chinese silver. And during this period, Chinese silver was not allowed to leave the country. And normally it was forged into Rembow, like, you know, the little dumpling shapes.
Yes.
And it was called, apparently in this region, it's called Piracy, which is, I think, a Cantonese term for it, which this is what all the Westerners called it too.
Okay.
So it's in these little sort of distinctive little ingots.
Yeah.
The problem is that once it's on the foreign boat, you can't just bring it to Canton and buy tea with it and silk.
They'll be like, where'd you get that from?
Yeah, where'd you get that from?
Yeah.
So they have to bring it back to Europe.
And reforge it.
Yeah, you know, but so basically it's leaving the Chinese economy. Right, because of this policy. This produces a flow of silver out of the country. So you have no new silver coming in, or a much less amount of new silver coming in, and now you have silver leaving.
Right.
And the population is still increasing.
Right.
Which means the inflation problem gets drastically worse in a very short period of time. Silver becomes very expensive compared to copper coins. So there's conflicting ideas about what to do. So everybody in the court, local officials, you know, it almost reminds me of like an internet forum. You have all these Confucian scholars writing letters back and forth in these little poetry societies about what should we do about the silver problems.
Was an economics position a thing in the Chinese court at this point? Is there someone in charge?
I mean, there's ministers of trade and stuff, but it's, you know,
is there a minister of finance?
You know, in the end, it's the minister of trying to convince the emperor to do something, right? And it doesn't really matter what somebody's position is on paper.
Right.
If the emperor decides you're going to do something else,
right,
then you're going to do something else.
Sorry, I was thinking of it as a modern government body. Yeah. It was like the cabinets, you know, but I guess not.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the emperor's on the fence, and everybody's got different ideas. So some people are
always on the fence.
So, yeah, he's sitting on the fence, the emperor.
Yeah. So they couldn't convince him to do anything.
Some of them. So another interesting that's happening during this time period is, you know, I talked about earlier how Manchus were, you know, basically ran the whole government. During this time period, though, there's kind of a relaxation, and if you're a Han Chinese scholar, you're allowed to form poetry. Your poetry societies, which are basically like political groups.
Okay.
And write your little white papers, write your little, you know, ideas about what you think should happen.
Interesting.
And these would get forwarded around different officials, and sometimes the emperor would read them.
Okay.
So
that seems like a pretty open environment.
So it's loosening up a bit, right? Because I think the less and less the Qing Dynasty is realizing, like, okay, we can't just have the Manchurians come in. We can't just have our banner forces just come in and kill everybody if there's a rebellion anymore. The White Lotus Rebellion was a complete mess.
Right.
So maybe we got to see if some of these Han Confucian scholars have any good ideas. There's kind of three competing camps.
Okay.
One is just ban all trade. One is like, we close Canton.
Right.
We close it off. We don't trade with them.
Yeah.
You know, if anybody talks to a foreigner, we kill them. You know, standard kind of Chinese empire
One very
stuff.
extreme school of thought.
Yes.
And then the other ones?
But basically the problem with that is people are like, well, the entire like south of China is dependent on not just the opium trade, but the foreign trade too.
Yes.
And it's going to probably cause a civil war.
Yeah.
If we completely ban all trade with foreigners.
Yes.
So they're like, okay, well, we can't do that, right? It's too big at this point. It's too big to fail.
Yeah.
So the next idea is let's legalize it. If opium is legal, it gives you a lot of advantages.
Yeah.
A, you can tax it. So now there's money coming in. It's going to go to Canton, which means, you won't have all these smuggling networks being developed.
Right.
And we'll pair that with increased enforcement because the little smuggling vessels, they're not like warships. They're not going to, Chinese, they're called war junks. The Chinese war vessels of this period are not very threatening, but they're still threatening to like a little smuggling ship.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not worth the effort for these smuggling ships to do all this if they could just sell it in Canton.
So it is easy to regulate, you're saying, once it's legal.
Once it's legal, right?
Okay.
So you do that, and sure, lots of people are going to die from opium abuse. But there's this sort of blasé attitude of like, well, they're drug users. We don't care about them, right? If you want to get addicted to opium and die, that's your own problem. And every year, more Chinese people are born.
Jesus. Yeah.
No, there's basically a letter where the guy says the equivalent of like, so what if some people die? It doesn't decrease our territory in any way. We already have a lot of people. Every year, more people are born. It's fine.
Population is getting too big anyways.
These people don't have jobs. They're losers. Also, you could then grow opium internally, which, that's a jobs program internally, Cherry.
Okay.
So there's a lot of advantages, and some very high profile people in the court were for legalization. And it seems like that's the way that the wind was blowing.
Okay.
And even the Westerners had caught wind, and they thought that it was going to happen too, that opium's just going to become legalized, and it's just, we're just going to trade it like anything else.
Right.
But then some very influential essays came out with a moral argument that was
Thank God.
a very Confucian argument, which is like we, the Qing Dynasty or the Chinese government, we're like the father, right?
Yes.
Confucian terms.
Yeah.
And what father would let their son do drugs? Right?
Yes.
And if we allow it, and if we say this is okay, then we have lost our moral standing as the patriarch of China, as the father of China, and our son will go on a bad path.
Right.
So we can't do this, right? We have to set the good example and ban opium.
Right. Let me guess which one won.
Yeah. So that's the one that won.
Yeah.
And it's going to cause a lot of problems because, on the small scale, it was effective. You have more penalties, you have more enforcement, you crack down on it, cut down on the smuggling networks, you burn all the opium pipes, you stop all the opium dens. And it was still kind of draconian because I think the idea was you give people a year to quit, and if anybody still smokes it after a year, you execute them.
Oh my God.
Which is, it's like putting down a dog.
Yeah.
And there was some concern beyond just the economics, like so the imperial exams, the exams are normally like a 3-day affair. where you basically get locked in a little room for 3 days and you write essays. And there was starting to be lots of people going into withdrawals, opium withdrawals, like after the first day of the the first day of the examinations. And it's not clear if this was people exaggerating,
right,
on their reports to make it seem worse.
It is kind of comical.
Yeah. Or you have some troops garrisoned somewhere for a while, and then you march them out, and everybody's falling over on the road, like, because they're having opium withdrawals. So, they're like, okay, this is a problem.
Right. So what happens? This might be a divergence in the road.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when you smoke opium? Like, on what level is it? What kind of a level of a drug? It's between
it's like
heroin and like...
Historically, you would eat it.
Okay.
And it's kind of a lower scale thing. I mean, obviously, things like morphine and heroin we have today are a complete different scale of
power. They're more pure, I'm supposed.
Yeah, more pure. but it's still the same basic effect, right? You feel euphoric, right? You don't feel pain.
Right.
You feel content. The real advance, though, is that traditionally it was eaten, but in China they started combining with tobacco and smoking it, which is more wasteful. You don't get as much of the drug.
Okay.
But it's a much, I guess, more intense high.
Okay.
And eventually they figure out how to vaporize it, which is the kind of standard opium pipe thing you see with the lamp and all that kind of shenanigans.
Yeah.
You get a much more intense effect from it. Because, as there's more and more opium, people start to experiment more with it, and they figure out what's the best high you can get from
the best way to enjoy it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People don't get addicted from, or, go through withdrawals for, doing it for a week. And the implication is that, more and more people are becoming heavy users and becoming addicted, right?
Okay. So you can get seriously addicted to it.
Oh yeah, no, it's just, it's people, you can die from it. It's just like opium or heroin or morphine or anything else. It's just not as concentrated, so you have to do more of it.
Okay.
But it's it's the same drug basically.
Okay.
Oh, and another thing that was happening during this time period is there started to be competition because other places realized like, oh wow, China's buying this stuff, and so Turkey sold it. Which apparently
they're like, let's make it too.
Yeah, let's make it too. So apparently Americans were the ones who typically trafficked in Turkish opium.
Okay.
And then other places in non-British controlled India, because they didn't have all of India, started selling it too. And it actually started to eat into the East India Company's profits. So they tried some things, they tried to buy it out, and then they're like, we'll just make more. So we'll just outproduce them.
Right.
So yeah, there was a lot of opium going in. So they basically decided to crack it down, and this was effective in the short term, but it was going to put China into conflict with the Western powers, which is going to cause the First Opium War, which is a whole big thing. And that leads into the last and most famous issue that was going on with the Qing Dynasty, which is barbarians at the gate, which is primarily the British, but foreigners causing problems
in China.
Okay. And kind of complicating everything else. The Qing Dynasty has no way to get to England and stop them from being annoying. You can go in, you can crush the White Lotus Rebellion.
Right.
You can do it with the pirates, but whatever you do temporarily, there's going to be a new wave of British traders causing shenanigans a couple of years from now.
Right.
So it's sort of just never ending.
When you say shenanigans, do you mean like they're in China locally on the ground and they're like doing crimes?
Okay, well, we're going to get to this.
Okay.
By the 1840s, which is when the First Opium War started, the British had been in China being annoying for roughly 200 years. In 1637, before the Qing Dynasty even existed, this is the Ming Dynasty, a British captain named Weddell led a fleet that attacked then Ming-controlled Canton in order to secure trade rights.
Okay.
And then burnt down a bunch of villages around it when they said no, and eventually got trade rights in Canton.
That's not nice.
Yeah. And then Canton was captured by the Qing, and the British lost their trade rights anyway, so it was a waste of time. Then eventually stuff opened up again. James Flint, we talked about before, the only Chinese-speaking Englishman, petitioned the emperor for more trade rights. He got arrested because he was being annoying. And that's in 1759.
He was being annoying. Okay.
1793 is the McCartney trade mission, and an even less successful one.
McCartney was annoying.
Yeah, McCartney was being annoying.
Yeah.
An even less successful one was led by Lord Amherst in 1816. Again, where they did other stuff. That time they were even less successful. They didn't even meet the emperor. They almost got in a sword fight with some eunuchs outside the imperial city. I think even inside the imperial city, the Forbidden City. The British attempted to seize Macau twice during the war with Napoleon.
Okay.
Both of which were diffused by tough Qing diplomacy. Portugal kind of came in on the side of France to an extent, where it's complicated about docking rights and stuff. But basically the British thought, we're going to lose access to Macau, and so we have to take it over. And the Qing Dynasty is like, absolutely not. Even though it was governed by Portugal, it's still owned by China. It's sort of like a lease.
It's like a rental agreement.
Like a rental. They're basically like, if you try and take over Macau, we're going to cut off all trade, and we're not going to give you any supplies. So you're basically going to die of starvation or thirst sitting out there.
Playing hardball.
Yeah. And it worked. It worked both times. They attacked the Canton forts twice during this time period. Once during the Amherst Friendship and Trade mission. They dropped off the mission in 1816 to go talk to the emperor. And then it's a long story, but they ended up getting in a fight with the forts and shooting cannons at each other, which is not a very successful friendship mission.
No.
And then again in 1833, because of a guy named Napier for no good reason. Both times they failed to achieve their goals. And this is the thing where the First Opium War, it's the biggest British move.
Yeah.
But it's not like it's the first.
Right. So they were always sort of like causing troubles.
They're always causing trouble.
And demanding things from the Qing government.
Yes. And it's partially just that the Qing government became weaker and less able to resist, and the British government and the British forces that it sent to cause shenanigans kept getting stronger.
Right.
So this guy named Napier, he got in basically a shouting match with the local. It's all this pathetic like Victorian
shouting match does sound
this
pretty...
Victorian era stuff of like you're supposed to go to Macau first and then tell the Chinese that you're the new official sent by the British,
right.
And they're supposed to invite you to come to Canton.
Okay.
And he just ignored it and went there. And then the Chinese official wouldn't meet with him because he didn't follow the protocol.
Right.
And so he got in this big thing, and eventually they're having a gunfight.
Oh my God.
And then Napier backed down, and he died of malaria. So
oh God.
The Qing won that one.
Right. But isn't that like, if you look back, right, and follow the narrative of like, it was the century of like shame.
Yeah.
And then you look at what the British people actually did do.
Yeah.
Which they were, by the description of this episode and the 2 episodes ago when we talk about the Macartney expedition, they're very annoying.
No, they
are.
They
don't want to follow the rules. They just want to be doing their empire things everywhere.
Yeah.
And they go, why should China be any different than these other places we've conquered?
Yeah.
Right? They just want to walk in and like improve, quote, the place and have everyone else bend to their rules.
China's case, they don't really want to conquer it. They just want China to be more convenient for them.
I don't think they could conquer China.
No,
Japan had tried.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's too big.
It's too big.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't have been worth it to them. But they basically, what's better than conquering China is if China just does everything you want.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And then you don't have to pay for the government.
Yeah.
You just make good money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're just real annoying. And it's funny though, because it kind of puts into perspective. And also, they don't want to follow the rules in Canton. They're sneaking their wives over. There's not supposed to be any. Okay, so you're only supposed to.
They're sneaking their wives over.
Okay, so this is a big thing that almost causes like a huge diplomatic incident and like a war, because you're not supposed to. There's not supposed to be any women in Canton. There's women in Macau.
You mean like
Western women?
Okay.
Because you're only supposed to be in Canton for like 8 months out of the year, 7 months out of the year for the trading season.
Oh, so they don't get like full residency?
No, they don't get full residency.
Like a limited visa.
You get
no
limited
spouse
visa.
allowed.
Yeah, no spouse allowed. Because they're like, we don't want you to get too comfortable.
What if you're a women trader? Am I kidding myself? Those don't exist. What am I doing?
Women don't have any head
tinted glasses.
They don't have any head for figures.
Right.
They're poor little heads. They couldn't do the math.
Yeah.
So
okay, so there were no female British traders or foreign traders.
Yeah.
Terrible times for women's rights everywhere.
Yes. In Canton.
So but some traders want to bring their wives.
Yes.
Or their women as per their possessions.
Yes.
And they're not allowed to, but they did it anyways, you're saying?
Yeah, they started sneaking them in.
Okay.
And it caused a big issue.
Okay.
This is gonna be a whole thing, but there's all these little things that the traders in Canton would do.
Okay.
Almost like they're bored, to just push the boundaries a little bit.
Just see
what
we can get.
Just try and piss the Chinese officials off, which is, the Chinese officials seem very, very patient. Like, for example, the Canton stuff, it's on like this area of land, and it's set, right? And the British don't own it. They don't even own the buildings. It's all run by Chinese. It's all built by Chinese people.
Okay.
They just get to stay there. It's like a hotel.
Right.
And it's almost like, like Epcot and Disneyland. You know, it's like there's a couple different, they're called factories, not because they make anything, but it's like a trade term.
Okay.
And it's like, oh, the British one and the Chinese servants try and make it look like what they think the British people will like.
Okay.
You know, like at one point the British think like, oh, we'd like a little bit more room to walk around. So they sneakily keep like dumping rocks off the side of one of their areas into the water to build a little like extension of the land. And they build I don't know, maybe like another like couple square meters.
So like, it's like what, the building's on an island?
It's kind of like on a piece of land going into the harbor.
Okay.
And they kind of would extend it, right?
Into the harbor. They made more land.
Yeah,
for themselves.
Yeah, made more like dirt and rocks and stuff to have more land. And they like plant a shrubbery there.
Okay.
Right? And then the Qing see it, and when the British are gone that winter, they like tear it down and like
they're trying to build a garden
and the British like send an official complaint that like you tore down our shrubbery and like and and then they start sneaking their wives in.
Okay.
And it's like, okay, first they sneak like one wife in and the Chinese are like, they notice.
Yeah.
Because first they're kind of secret about it.
Okay.
But I mean, obviously all the servants are Chinese. They know that the lady's there, but they're like, you know what, let's just not worry about it, right? Let's just. But then the British go, oh, I guess it means it's okay, right? So
Okay.
then like they're going to, they have like 3 or 4 wives over there.
Okay.
And the Chinese people go like, no, you gotta send the wives back. And it becomes
We're really talking about wives as like a
I know, but that's what it was,
like
right?
a bag of goods.
Yeah, like a bag of goods.
Gotta
Like,
send her back.
Yeah.
Okay. So they said you gotta send them back, and then what?
It's like pets on the airplane. It's like comfort animals.
Right.
They allowed it, and then people now everybody's got a comfort animal on the airplane.
Right.
So it caused a big incident, and the British people are like, how dare you? This is the honor of our British women are at stake, and so it's all
I
this.
don't know if the honor of British women
Yeah.
was at stake, considering they were treated like pets.
Yeah.
It's like me bringing my cat, sneaking my cat into
A
the.
motel.
Yeah, I think the problem's bigger than
Yeah.
just British women's.
No pet policy.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of little things like this that they're
Okay.
doing constantly,
Okay.
which is real annoying. And eventually the wives get sent back, but to Macau.
Okay.
And then on outside of Canton, one thing that happens in this time period is you get more and more British people who speak Chinese. And you have Chinese dictionaries being written.
Right.
You have the Qing legal codes translated into...
Wasn't that illegal for Chinese people to teach foreigners Chinese?
It was, but they
changed
figured it
it?
out,
Okay.
right? They did it sneakily.
Okay.
And eventually, once you have Chinese dictionaries that you've made,
Right.
once you have, all this stuff translated, you can't really stop them.
Right.
Right?
You lost that battle.
So now you have all of these people who can read Qing documents. They can understand the Qing legal code. They can go into court and argue
about it
in cases, which is real annoying. And then, right? And
well, if you think they could read the code, they wouldn't bring their wives over.
Because before the official would tell the translator, and the translator would tell the person. But now you have all these British people arguing directly
Right.
with Qing officials.
Right.
Like, no, that's not what it says here.
Right.
Which is real annoying. Because of that, now you have people who can sneak into China, cause shenanigans. So you have people trying to get in through Tibet. Normally it's missionaries.
Okay.
But there's also some adventurer types.
Okay.
And obviously you think like, wouldn't they realize that's obviously a white person
Right.
trying to sneak into China?
Yeah.
But China's a big place. There's a lot of different groups of people in China.
It's not that many white people, though.
I know, but does a person in China know there's no white people in China? Someone who's never seen a white person? Right? If they say if they say they're Mongolian or something, like how does somebody
I've never
like
seen
in
a Mongolian
Fujian
before.
province know?
Right.
You know what I mean? What does people look like?
Sure. Okay.
Right? And so like one guy, he's this Prussian, so like German guy.
Okay.
He would sneak in quite successfully for months at a time, and he would just say he's from Singapore. And it's like, I guess that's what Singaporean people look like, right? They don't know.
Okay.
They've never been to Singapore.
Right.
So you have that, and they're dropping off like translated publications into Chinese about like the rights of man and like Christian stuff
Yeah.
and all sorts of things. They're going around, they're mapping the coasts. They're putting like Bible tracts in the opium chests. They're just doing all this annoying stuff.
Okay.
This is put into hyperdrive in the 1830s because the East India Company loses its monopoly for British trade in China. So previously, the only company that could do trade from the United Kingdom to China and back was the East India Company. Yeah. Which is not a good company.
Well, I think history has,
yes.
But that conclusion.
What they are, though, is they're big. And because they're big, they're a known entity. And they kind of keep some of the shenanigans from getting out of hand because they kind of self-police.
Oh, so you mean they're like a corporation?
They're like a corporation.
They got rules.
They've got rules.
Okay.
And they realize like, oh, if we let shenanigans happen, we could lose all of our trade to China.
Right.
So they kind of try and keep things under control, and they have a relatively good relationship with the Qing government. Huh. They don't smuggle opium themselves. They stay out of that.
No, they just sell it to other people.
They sell it to other people, but hey, we said not to bring it to China. That's your problem.
Right.
So they have a relatively good relationship. They have lots of people who speak Chinese.
Okay.
They have essentially a ban on missionary work.
Okay.
You can't do any of that stuff. But after I think it's 1833, the floodgates are open. Anybody can go to China and trade, which means
troublemakers.
You have all sorts of troublemakers. You have people selling opium and regular stuff. Now it's kind of a race to the bottom, right? Because you can make more money by ignoring what the Qing government tells you.
Right. The regulations.
Yeah. Screw the regulations. And arguably, this last group, these missionaries going in and doing all the shenanigans, is what sets off the Taiping Civil War because. Right. The guy who starts it finds a translated, I think it's a New Testament Bible passage translated into Chinese, and he reads it and goes, I'm Jesus' brother. Yeah. So not to say he wouldn't have caused a rebellion anyway, but if it wasn't for all these people sneaking like Bible tracts into the opium, right? Because the missionaries would work with the opium smugglers because both were illegal, and you couldn't go meet Chinese people and try and convert them in Canton because they won't let you. Right. But hey, you're going to land on some little fishing village.
Does God say anything about smuggling drugs in the Bible?
Cherry, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. So,
okay.
You gotta smuggle a little opium and translate for some opium smugglers.
Just seems like unlikely bed buddies.
Cherry, you know what's the real opium?
What?
God. So.
Good point.
So that's what they're doing. So this is all happening leading up to the First Opium War. You have the Qing Dynasty getting weaker. You have huge population boom. Right. You have failure of the civil service to adapt to the changing conditions. You have a huge monetary problems with inflation. Military's not getting any funding. Military's weak. Corruption. Opium.
British people being annoying.
And it's not
challenging the Chinese court.
Yeah, and it's not just the British people, but it's mostly the British people. Okay. The Americans do smuggle opium because the Americans are a big piece, but the Americans do smuggle opium, but it's a smaller percentage. Okay. And the Americans tend to actually have a better relationship with the Chinese merchants than the British do because they're less stuffy. Like
stuffy.
Yeah, the British
speaking like a true American yourself.
Yeah, well, the British have this sort of this air, which I think becomes apparent when you look at the First Opium War, which is like China's a colony, it just doesn't know it yet.
Yeah, right. There's an arrogance.
There's an arrogance to it, right?
And America was just, if I remember it correctly, was just establishing itself internationally.
Oh yeah,
so it's playing very nice.
Yeah.
Unless you're with the British. America's not playing nice, but
yeah. So there's a bit more of like, they make friends with these people, and it's it's a bit different, but yeah. So I mean, it's rough. I think it's just a stressful time to be it's a stressful time. Gone are these like emperors who ruled for like 60 years, right? I just think it's too stressful.
No, it's not because it's too stressful. It's because they lost the mandate of the heaven.
Oh, that's true. It's like a stat bonus.
It's a sign.
Yeah.
From God. From heaven. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is, if the First Opium War had happened, 40 years earlier, or some of these things hadn't happened, it might have turned out much differently, but it's rough. Obviously, the British have a big technological advantage, right, over China at this point. But it's not that big of one. Everyone's using black powder and cannons that you load from the front.
Right.
And
China was using it too.
Yeah, right. I mean,
Okay.
you know, so by the First Opium War, you know, there's steamships.
Right.
But the British have one steamship. You know, it's not that big of one.
They don't have a fleet.
They don't have a fleet of steamships, right? And so it's
So you're saying if it's just by technological levels,
yeah,
it's like I'm talking about a video game, like the
Yeah.
technological tree that who has unlocked what. Like the British people haven't unlocked all that much more than the Chinese military has.
yeah,
And so if that was the only consideration without all these other things weighing the Chinese party down,
yeah.
it might not have been might have not lost so easily and quickly and humiliatingly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That gap is going to grow. But also, I mean, China's going to import foreign weapons. It's going to start producing this stuff locally.
Right.
You know, in the end, I mean, compared to, you know, China has like 30 times the population of England at this point.
Don't you forget that.
And it is the sort of thing that if there was more muscle behind it, if there was more willpower,
But they have other problems to solve.
they have other problems to solve. And also, you know, as we talked about for part of this, the whole economy of that whole region is based around trade with foreigners.
Right.
You know what I mean? You can't really just shut that down or convince people to fight that hard.
Right. Against trade.
Yeah, against trade because
Yeah.
it's their whole economy.
Right.
So yeah, things are rough. Things are rough going into the First Opium War. It's a bad time to be a Qing emperor, and it's not all just because of opium. Opium is one part of the salad,
The salad.
the soup, if you will. One ingredient. But yeah, hopefully that's interesting to people. I saw a couple people rated our podcast on various things, so if you did that, thank you for that. We appreciate it. But yeah, thank you for listening and have a nice day.
We'll see you next time.